Hello, welcome back to History 476. I'm Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is video lecture number 2. Now, we had finished up the previous lecture. We had just began to talk about internal improvement, that so-called third leg of that three-legged stool um, of economic nationalism. All right, so let's continue there. Um, in the year 1803, now this is absolutely prior to the uh, time of the War of 1812. In the year 1803, the Ohio Territory, became a state. Um, it was obvious that America was expanding physically, geographically, and it was also obvious, even as early as 1803, that something was needed, some changes were needed to tie what already was a huge nation, tie it together with a series of uh, bridges and roads. So in 1803, Congress decided that, of course, uh, the Ohio Territory, the state of Ohio, I'm sorry, the state of Ohio would grow um, partly through by the sale of national land that was located within the state of Ohio, to sell that land to settlers who wanted to come west. And since Congress expected, and by the way, they were correct. Congress expected that a lot of people would flock into the new state of Ohio. They figured that a way to kill a couple of birds with one stone would be to sell that federal land that was located within the state of Ohio. And what they decided to do was that 5% of the money that was generated by the sale of land in Ohio would be dedicated to building a so called national road. A national road. Now, that national road would begin on the Atlantic Ocean, and it would go west all the way to the state of Ohio. So, Congress says that 5% of all the money that was realized by selling federal land in Ohio would be dedicated to building this national road. Now that happens in 1803. Now, things don't happen overnight, but nevertheless, by 1806, Jefferson, who was the president at that time, gave the go ahead for the state of Ohio to be surveyed. Now, because you cannot sell land unless you know what you're selling. And the only way you can know what you're selling is to survey it officially. So Jefferson authorized the survey in 1806. And construction of the National Road began in 1811. Now, the National Road, if you really want to get picky about it, the National Road was the first federally funded interstate highway. Uh, it eventually uh, it ran. Remember, the plan was for it to run from the Atlantic Ocean in Maryland, by the way, all the way to Ohio. But they increased the length of the road so that by the year 1838, it ran all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the state of Illinois. It was the first federally funded interstate road network. It wasn't just that one road. Once that first road was built, other newer roads hooked into it. And so eventually, an entire network of roads ran east and west, generally east and west, from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Illinois. And this really helped the expansion of that entire area. Wherever that road ran, it helped uh, the growth of commercial agriculture, for example. In 1817, uh, John C. Calhoun of the state of South Carolina introduced a bill into the Congress. Um, and the idea behind this bill, this 1817 bill, was to remember the $1.5 million um, from that the Bank of the United States paid for the right to invest United States money in our economy. $1.5 million. Well, John C. Calhoun wanted to earmark that $1.5 million. He wanted to make it very clear that that $1.5 million would only be used to finance internal improvements such as roads and bridges and things like that. Um, but the bill was opposed by people from both New England and the South because those were the two areas that would have profited least from Calhoun's plan. Even though Calhoun was from South Carolina, he was from the far eastern part of the South, wasn't he? So um, these petty squabbles that took place back during these days, quite often it was based not on what was best for the nation, it was based on what was best for your region, or maybe even what was best for your state, or maybe even what was best for your particular area in the state. But nevertheless, the bill was opposed by both New England and the South. The most of the support came from the western states. Now let me stop right here and let me explain to you uh, what I what I'm making reference to when I say the Western states. Now, when we talk about the West today, we're talking about California and Oregon and Washington and Colorado and Utah and places like that. The West, right? No, not then. The West. Remember, the United States didn't even own that country yet, and so those places were certainly not states yet. In 1817, when we talk about the West, we're talking about the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. That was the West of those days. Remember, the western boundary of the United States was the Mississippi River. And so it stands to reason that the western part of the United States would be between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. Now, support for Calhoun's bill uh, dedicating this $1.5 million to specifically to help pay for federally funded internal improvements came from the West, which and the West desperately needed the roads. Clay, Henry Clay of Kentucky, who we've already mentioned, remember, Speaker of the House, Clay warmly supported the bill, which was not surprising because he would become the architect of what we still refer to in American history as the American system, which is, uh, we will, when we talk about the American system, we will discover that it played a very intimate role with the creation of internal improvements paid for by the federal government. In 1816, Clay had already claimed that the Constitution did give the Congress the authority to appropriate money for internal improvements. Now, the Republicans generally were opposed to the federal government paying for internal improvements. Why? Well, it's very simple. The answer is a really easy answer. Remember that the Republicans were strict interpreters. They were narrow interpreters of the Constitution, and they opposed the federal government paying for these internal improvements. But they would ask the question, where in the Constitution does it say that federal money can be spent to finance federal internal improvements. And of course, the legitimate answer was it's not in there. And if it's not in there, we're not going to support it, is what the Republicans said. But people like Clay foresaw the expansion of the United States and the need to interpret the Constitution liberally or widely in order to keep pace with this growth and to advance the general welfare of the nation as a whole. Now, Madison, it's 1817. Madison is still the president of the United States, and the Congress passes Calhoun's bill. They send it to the president's desk for his approval or his veto. He has the choice, and Madison vetoes it. Why? Well, you already know the answer to that. It is because nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the national government uh, should pay for internal improvements. And remember, that's why the Republican Party came into existence at the very beginning. Was this argument over a wide interpretation or a narrow interpretation of the Constitution? Madison was one of those narrow interpreters, and therefore he said that using federal funds to pay for internal improvements was unconstitutional. And as a result, internal improvements remained, with just a few exceptions, the responsibility of states and private enterprise for another 100 years until around the end of the First World War. It was not until then that it became acceptable for the federal government to pay for the cost of internal improvement. Now, so this question of who pays for the internal improvements, who pays for the bridges, who pays for the roads, who pays for the ferries, who pays for all that stuff, it's sort of up in the air, isn't it? It seems in 1817, it seems that it's been settled, and that if anybody wants an internal improvement done, they're going to have to do it themselves. They're going to have to do it at the state level, or they're going to have to do it with private or corporate funds. But we know, because we can see the future, we know that that will change in the early part of the 20th century. Now, despite questions about who is responsible for financing internal improvements, a national market for goods and services continued to grow. Farmers and manufacturers expanded production. Farmers were putting more and more land into cultivation. They were using scientific farming to produce more corn per acre, more cotton per acre, more tobacco per acre. So production was expanding, and it was expanding between with both farmers and manufacturers. Mills and factories began to sprout uh, everywhere across the landscape, but especially in certain areas. Uh, remember now, what powered these early, rather primitive factories? It was water power. It was a water wheel that was turned by the force of the water. Uh, Belts were attached to the water wheels, and the belts then drove or caused machinery to turn. So it was, in our estimation, this is really primitive stuff, but this was really cutting edge stuff in 1815, 16, 1817. So wherever there was fast flowing water, mills and factories began to pop up. Now, most of them were in the Northeast because that's where most of the really, really dependable, fast-flowing streams were. But there were other areas that had fast-flowing streams too, even in the South, in North Carolina, um, in the mountains of North Carolina. Uh, Mills were built to harness the power of that fast moving water. Same thing was happening in Tennessee, northern Georgia. So these places were becoming more and more manufacturing centers. But let's don't get carried away and assume that that manufacturing became the most important part of their economy. It's not true at all. Agriculture continued to be the most important part of their economy. I'm simply telling you that for the first time, manufacturing made its appearance in areas which had always depended strictly on agriculture. These manufacturing sites, these what are to our eyes really primitive manufacturing locations, were among the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Something else was happening during this general time, or something else was beginning to happen during this general time period. Uh, this rapid industrial expansion was beginning, despite the questions about who was going to pay for the bridges and who was going to pay for the roads. That national market for goods and services did, in fact, exist, as evidenced by the fact that both farmers and manufacturers were expanding their production. But something else happens in addition to that. Commercial agriculture and factories began to replace subsistence farming and household production. Now, let's talk about subsistence living. In a subsistence economy, everybody raises for themselves all the things that they need for themselves. Okay? Every mouthful of food that you eat, you raise. As my grandmother would say, every stitch of clothing that you have on, you made. You either raised the cotton and spun the thread and wove the thread into garments, or you raised the sheep and the goats and you sheared them and you spun that uh, uh, that fleece into thread, and then you wove the thread into garments. Whatever you ate and whatever you wore, you were responsible for. Only when you did not have the ability to create a thing did you buy that thing. For example, uh, the typical American farm during this time period, they raised all their food. Uh, they they provided their own clothing. What about gunpowder? Huh? What about gunpowder? What if you wanted to go hunting for meat, um, and you didn't know how to make gunpowder? Or you wanted to go hunting for meat, and you did not have access to lead on your property, right? To dig up and to melt and to form into bullets. Well, if that was the case, then what the farmer would do, he would raise a little bit extra. He would sell it, sell extra food for cash, or he would barter, he would trade, and he would buy the things with the extras that he could not provide for himself. And this was not uncommon. among subsistence farmers. Thomas Jefferson uh, coined a term which we as historians should be familiar with. Historians themselves have referred to this as Jefferson's agrarian, 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 which is a fancy word for farming, okay? Agriculture, agrarian. The Jeffersonian agrarian ideal says that the average person in America should be a independent and self-sufficient farmer who owned his own land. He didn't lease land, he didn't rent land. He owned his own land, and that permitted him to raise what he chose when he chose it. And it also gave him the ability to raise a little bit extra to provide for himself and his family those things that he could not provide for himself. The Jeffersonian agrarian ideal. Now, in 1816, James Madison completes the second of his two-year terms. Uh, he was elected first in 1808, and he was elected the second time in 1812. Now it's 1816. Madison does not run for re-election. But as a matter of fact, let's talk about that for just a moment. The Constitution, the original Constitution of 1787, did not limit presidents to a particular number of terms. Presidents could be elected as often as the people would keep electing them. But when George Washington, the first president, came to the end of his second term, he decided to retire, uh, and and he did. And Washington was so highly regarded, was so highly respected that the politicians of his day and continuing for a long time continued to honor that idea, the idea that a president would serve two terms and then would voluntarily retire. Uh, Washington had done it, Jefferson had done it, now Madison does it. He retires voluntarily after two terms. And in his place, James Monroe is elected president of the United States. Now, Monroe is an interesting character, and so let's look at let's do a little biographical thumbnail sketch of James Monroe. He was 16 years old when the Revolutionary War broke out. He was a Virginian. As a matter of fact, he was a student. He was a college student at William and Mary in the state of Virginia. And when the war broke out, he dropped out of school and joined the Continental Army. He was wounded in combat at the Battle of Trenton. And from all we could gather, was distinguished himself any number of times during the war. Um, and although he joined the Continental Army as a plain private soldier, by the time the war was over, he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, which was quite the accomplishment. When the war ended, he studied law with his friend Thomas Jefferson and became for lack of a better term, became a disciple of Jefferson. He became a Jeffersonian. Now, uh, Monroe did not have the great, the towering intellect that an Adams or a Jefferson, and certainly not a Madison, possessed. Uh, but he was dedicated, nevertheless, he was dedicated to public service. Jefferson said something of Monroe that I would love to have said at my funeral someday. What Jefferson said was that if Monroe's soul was turned inside out, it would be found to be spotless. Wow, that's a mouthful. His soul would be found to be spotless. Um, Monroe paid his dues as he worked his way up through the political ranks. He served in the Virginia legislature. He later served as the governor of Virginia. Um, he served in the um, Articles of Confederation Congress. After the Constitution was written, he served as a United States senator from Virginia. He also served as a United States minister to the nation of France, very important diplomatic position. He also served as U.S. minister to England and as well to Spain. So the three major nations of Europe. Monroe knew how those governments worked intimately because he had served as the minister to all three of those nations, to France, to England, and to Spain. Now, uh, closer to home, he served as both Secretary of State and Secretary of War under James Madison. In 1816, remember in 1816, in the election of 1816, Madison decides not to run. Now, um, the uh, and so Monroe ran as a Republican against one of the last Federalist presidential candidates, a man by the name of Rufus King of New York. It was a landslide in favor of Monroe. You don't have to remember these numbers. I'll give them to you. The Electoral College numbers were 183 for Monroe, 34 for Rufus King. So it was almost a 6-to-1 margin. A it was an it was a tsunami, if you will. He was the last of the revolutionary generation. He was among the last of the revolutionary generation to serve in the White House. Now, when I say the revolutionary generation, I'm talking about someone who was alive and who was an adult during the American Revolution. There would be additional presidents who served in the White House who were alive during the Revolutionary War. Okay, but there's a big difference between serving in the Revolutionary